Welcome back. Well, we're now going to be focusing on a celebration which is happening today. It's International Democracy Day. Yes, today is International Democracy Day. There is a whole day set aside to celebrate that form of government which is tagged, or which is defined as government of the people, by the people, and for the people. Well, this form of democracy we have practiced now since 1999, and a number of people can tell you, what they feel about how far we've gone. I'm sure if we do a poll about what our democracy has been like, it certainly will be a mixed bag. But then we will have experts in our studio today to tell us just how we're faring. Are we really along the path of democracy? Does democracy have to be there for you to have development? Because oftentimes there's been this big debate about whether it is democracy you truly need to have development, whether democracy is really suited, at least democracy as practiced elsewhere, is suited to our own demographic here in Nigeria. But what do I know? Let us introduce our guests in the studio this morning. We have with us Dr. Saeed Hussaini, you're the Director of Research at the Center for Democracy and Development. Welcome to Sunrise Daily this morning.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me.
And Dr. Okey Ikechukwu, Executive Director of Development Specs Academy. It's always a pleasure to have you in our studios.
My pleasure.
In Abuja. Well, let's quickly, sink our teeth into the discussion. Democracy. Usually, I don't know, the word seems to have become ubiquitous, if you ask me, meaning different things to different people. But if you were to assess from what we know and from what we take as the generic definition of democracy, how would you say that we have fared in terms of not just our selection process, but in terms of even how we throw up the candidate, if that is also going to be a part of the democratic process, and how we get along in terms of, getting the form of government we've chosen to deliver what we now call the dividends of democracy. Let me ask you, let me come to you, Dr. Hussaini. I'd like to hear, I have spoken with Dr. Ikechukwu a few times, so let's hear what your perspective are in terms of Nigeria's journey so far along this path of democracy.
Okay, thank you. I think just setting out the big picture, our return to democracy in 1999 was quite a laudable achievement for a country which, through its history, has, of course, had a lot of dark periods of authoritarian rule. And as you were setting out the introduction, you talked about the fact that there's an ongoing debate about whether or not democracy is the most appropriate form of government for achieving development or for a context like ours. But our own experience, I think, is the best answer to that question. Because, of course, in a period when we had autocratic rule in the form of a military dictatorship, the development strides that were achieved were minimal at best. So for that reason, a lot of people were elated when democracy returned in 1999. And, of course, a lot of people fought for it across social and political spectrums. And the fact that we've managed since then to maintain a regular practice of elections every 4 years is hugely laudable for a country at our stage of economic development, for a country as diverse as ours, for a country as large as ours. So there are, of course, things to celebrate today, and it's appropriate on a day like this to also reflect on those markers of, let's say, progress. At the same time, of course, we shouldn't deceive ourselves. Nigerians across the country are dissatisfied with the pace of democracy, understood, I think, as a process designed to transfer power from the elite, be they economic or traditional, to ordinary people. As you were saying in the introduction, fundamentally, it's a system of government that promises to give people the capacity to govern themselves. So the question to answer on a day like this is, can we, or are we exercising that capacity to govern ourselves as ordinary citizens? And it's clear that we're not exercising it as much as we desire, right? There are limitations of all sorts that are placed on the average Nigerian, barring them from fully exercising that democratic franchise. So there's many more battles to be fought, but some have been won from the perspective of actually at least getting our social, political, economic elite to concede that indeed it is our right to cast a ballot and choose our leadership.
So many, I don't know, let's say paradoxes you raised there, and also it's pretty simple, but it's also pretty deep in terms of when you look at what has happened. I do know that there are people who sometimes when they talk about how we have transitioned from
Autocratic.
from autocratic rule to a democracy, from military rule. I was looking for that word, military rule. They sometimes say, oh, the soldiers just removed their uniform and donned their agbadas, and business as usual continued. I was somewhere yesterday, they were talking about the mindset that needed to change. That for many years we were under the military rule, or authoritarian rule, and it was seen that when we changed form of government, the mindset really did not change. And it was seen that somehow we as a people, maybe we're not quite sure what to expect, and we're being told, it's your right. I mean, even now, we still have lots of campaign telling people, this is a democracy. You have the right to do this. There's so many, you are involved in those kinds of campaigns at your organization. But let me come to you, Dr. Oke Ikechukwu, whether you think that we have fully made the transition. He talked about the people's power to govern themselves, as opposed to the elite, because somehow it looks like there is a dichotomy. Is it a false narrative, or is it really something that needs to happen, where the people truly feel empowered? Are they the ones empowering the elite, or is it that the elite should transfer power to the people? How do you see this divide?
I don't really see a divide. What I see is that democracy calls for responsible management of power, of state power, to benefit both the people and the elite. Now, you started with a definition, and I'd like to take us back to that. Government of the people, by the people, and for the people. And I ask myself, between 1999 and today, which people have benefited from democracy? Those who have benefited from democracy are actually people who have held political office. Their personal affairs are much better. They are in greater control of their economic affairs. They have more influence. They can drive you and I off the road as they go.
Yes, you say you don't see a divide.
No. I say fundamentally.
Yes.
In the ideal setting, the business of democracy is to give all of us space.
Indeed.
So I now migrated back to why we're not there.
Okay.
That in place of this ideal, this is what we have today. And you raised the question at the commencement of this conversation about whether the processes are on, whether we can look at, do we have party democracy? The answer is no. Across all the political parties, whether in power or not, because candidates are not chosen democratically. We know that. We can pretend that it is not so. So when the question is asked, have we gained? I'll not only say no, I'll add that we have actually retrogressed. Retrogressed to the point that at the commencement of this democracy, there was the illusion of local government chairmen, councillors, and the rest of it. We moved into the democracy. Local government councils were unilaterally dissolved by governors. And so that's a step back, it's a loss to democracy. People no longer thought they should hold their local government chairman responsible because they are there at the pleasure of the governor. At the level of the state, the same thing. Now, at the level of party, internal party democracy, the same problem. And so you find that even at the level of the there's the fundamental and then there are the incidentals. At the level of the fundamentals of democracy, which is values, how we relate, the fact that you have a right to a free choice and the rest of it, we've lost mileage at the level of fundamentals. At the level of incidentals, which you will then say are the dividends of democracy, what are the indices? What will you call the key performance indices? Is it social infrastructure? Is it roads? Is it electricity? Is it citizen welfare? Is it the state of the economy? Is it national security? So even at the level of incidentals, that look, you've got it right at the fundamental level, all the values are right. Now, at the level of living, we've lost substantial mileage across all measuring platforms. So my initial observation here is that as we celebrate democracy today, International Democracy Day, there are about 4 questions to ask. Does democracy necessarily improve citizen welfare? That's number one. Number two, the understanding of democracy. Is it possible to have the institutions of democracy and no democracy? Because we have all the institutions. The answer is also yes. Is it possible to, replace what you call the people with interests of probably the three of us? And so when we speak of democracy, government of the people, by the people, for the people, it turns out to be government of Hussaini, okay, and the Maokbe, Foke and Maokbe, and the rest of the people in the hall are getting angry on our behalf when we quarrel. Those are the issues.
It's amazing. I mean, you even have to chuckle as well. Yesterday, I was involved in a conversation right here in our studios, and it was very interesting. We're looking at internal party politics in the APC. They're getting ready for their state congresses, and as a matter of fact, they'll start sale of forms today. It was very interesting seeing how even saying that we're practicing a democracy within political parties.
It's not happening.
Within political parties, they're afraid of voting. They'd rather have consensus candidates. And this, it's very interesting, because if that's how it's run in political parties, largely it will seem that maybe that is what is also happening at the polls. There is some ceremony around, voting. But maybe there is sometimes unspoken agreement that, there have been. I don't know. I'm just saying. Because, I mean, the implications of the question I'm asking has far-reaching ramifications. First and foremost, we're worried about the kinds of candidates that are thrown up at elections. And then we also worry about the sanctity of the polls. We've been saying in recent times voter apathy, and a lot of people, are trying to reinvigorate the populace, the electorate, to say, look, your votes will count. Your votes do count. Your vote is your power. And people should go out to the polls. However, if it does seem that somehow this consensus candidacy business continues from inside the political parties to the polls, even amongst political parties, isn't there a problem? Is our democracy in danger? Let me ask you if you sense this.
Well, I want to affirm a lot of what the doctor said in terms of the previous challenges that face Nigerian democracy. There's no escaping it, like I said. And you're right to say that the parties are key culprits in blocking the path or keeping us at a stage that's far from what is generally desirable. You're right to also point out the significant challenges of insecurity, the economy that's not distributing resources equitably, the list goes on, corruption, etc. But I just want to say that I think it's important to also be careful in having that conversation within a context where, in the wider sub-region, we've seen 3 coups in, a period under a year, at least 5 months.
Very true.
So I think that we should also affirm these values, and despite the fact that they are not being realized, because we've seen the opposite, and it certainly has not redounded to the benefits of the wider citizenry. So I think it's important just to affirm that to begin with, and say that even the symbol of one person, one vote is not meaningless. It's a base from which we can build a functional democracy. That we've not gotten there yet, or that there are significant challenges that have emerged in the context of us trying to practice this, is a given that I think even people in power would admit to. So I guess, in summary, what I would say there is that what are the solutions, right? What's the way forward? It can't be simply throwing our hands up and saying that there are significant challenges and what do we do next? Or it can't be retreating into out of the public sphere into our private spaces and deepening the apathy that you so rightly point to. It has to be more democracy, actually. And this is particularly true within the parties, as you say. If we don't have the capacity within parties to select candidates on the basis of their popularity, on the basis of their platform, then ultimately the choices that the wider electorate is presented with are already narrowed. So I completely agree with the sentiments there from the perspective of the essential kind of requirement of needing to deepen party democracy. And we certainly are far from where we want to be. But I think there's enough, there is a base that we can build on. And I want to say that I find that that's quite important to emphasize.
Well, I don't know if you see a streak there, even though you have recommended that the cure to our ills is even more democracy. The cure to little democracy is even more democracy. However, sometimes you do sense a pushback. You sense a pushback from political parties. I'm just wondering now if you see a streak of hope. I mean, in recent times, we've seen not just, yes, the polls are one thing, but the part of governance that should come with, that should come with our democratic process, the path of accountability. We've seen in recent times more and more young people, who are the majority of our demographic, demand accountability. And indeed, as you rightly pointed out, there are things to celebrate in this democracy. Yesterday, I happened to be at the anniversary celebration of Budget, the NGO which is, set itself to, explain the budget of the national of the federation, not just at the federal level, but also at the state level, down, to ordinary citizens, and put that as a tool. However, a fundamental question was asked as to how we're engaging, even with the information at our disposal. Some people say, however, that the fact that such an organization can exist and it was formed by young people does point to the fact that there is an increasing engagement with the process, however slow the results might be. Is it something that you agree with? Does it really give you hope that indeed more and more, because we've seen protests so far, but we've also seen young people putting in the work to say, we're not just going to be, shouting slogans, we're also willing to do the work that you need to move this country forward?
Yes, I'll respond to that. After that, I'll touch on the solutions. Yes, it is good that the budget should be interrogated all the way, across all the levels. So it's a positive development. But beyond the interrogation of the budget, they must take two other steps. Answer the question, is there a difference between expenditure and impact on citizen welfare? The answer is yes. So that organization has to take that further step. Okay, you've spent X amount of money on roads. Do you now have roads? You spent so and so amount of money carrying out this project. That project you carried out, who did it serve? The contractor or the people? Mr. Governor, you've spent 4 billion on new schools. Did you recruit new teachers? The ones around, did you spend money training them? Did you improve their pay? So this is a very good, so it's a platform. We can only now give them more and more to put on the table. Now, having dealt with that, we move to the next.
Oh, no, they say that what they're trying to do is provide information so the citizens can ask the questions.
I'm giving them more work. There is no citizen platform. You see, let's not set up delusional platforms. I set up an NGO and our business to just ask questions and go home. We think we're doing enough. You must do terrain analysis. What kind of citizen do we have that I'm giving this assignment? Where do they meet? Nowhere. So you that have awakened, the consciousness that has risen in you, take on the job. There's no place on earth where citizens, first, what medium did you use? Newspapers, right? Television. In a country where over 68% of the people at any material time do not have electricity. And where those who listen to radio have specific stations they listen to. I'm talking genuine national development now. Go do the real work that will matter.
But isn't that a problem? Because
it is.
How do citizens then engage?
The point is this. Citizen engagement means that if you want to engage, probably there are 3 people who listen to him. I go and talk to him. There are 19 people who listen to you. I come and talk to you. There are power centers all over the country. If you want things to happen in my town and you establish a relationship with the town union president, you have a 50% head start. I want to go to a particular community in Kano, and I look around. There are a few popular imams, and I talk with them before I get to the people. The fact that they'll be sitting beside me has given me endorsement. So this elite artificial engagement where we make speeches in halls containing 300 people, and I assume we are addressing not just the United Nations, but people in their kitchens. The elite, the young people who are trying to make a change, must also understand the national demographics. It's not about headlines, it's not about reports, it's not about getting an award, promise the youth to watch in the next 5 years, you keep the plaque in your house, and you appear to, no, it's more than that. Our country is in trouble. We need development. So they must be commended for this, but we should put more on their table. This is help. Help us. The citizens you're saying you're showing the figures, they don't know what to do with it. It doesn't impact their lives. That's assignment one. Assignment two, let them push state governments and the federal government to budget in consultation. You come to my village, you say we need what you might call a legacy project, and you build a fine monument. And that's all you've done for me. It makes no impact. So this is a good thing. They should build on it. The other thing on the matter of what to do, solutions. You see, our parties are the way they are today because they are not parties until a few months before elections. Let all the political parties every month have at least one rally in 1 or 2 or 3 local governments merged throughout the 4 years, whether they're in power or not. Now, that enables party members to come together. That enables party chairmen across the local governments to meet each other. That enables them to quarrel over funds for hiring buses and all of that. Then you build party solidarity. You leaders will know themselves. It's not so during the election they come together. Secondus, when he became chairman, there was a workshop they organized, ever the takeoff. These were some of the things I put on table for them. We need political opposition, not because we hate the party in power, but because with opposition, the party in power will perform better. Awu showed us the example. So please have these rallies, rotate it among all the local governments, and it's affordable. What does it require? If the parties begin to do that, the first thing that will happen is that we begin to build followership. You'll find that 2 of us can quarrel because I don't agree with what's in your manifesto, and you don't agree with mine. That shows we are becoming ideological members of our parties, and not just people who attend rallies and are giving money, among several other measures. But I'm sure my colleague will have something to say before I get back on that.
Okay, but just before you say anything, let's quickly play this report. Dr. Kayode Fayemi and trying to remember who now, but Dr. Kayode Fayemi was asking citizens to be more alert. To participate more in our democracy. You have said that there are no, the platforms are not exactly the platforms for engagement, and they're power silos, you would say, all over the country. But we'll come to that. Let's quickly take a listen to this report.
Please. Several advocacy groups gathered to mark a decade of critical analysis of Nigeria's budgeting system, organized by civil society organization Budget. One issue that continues to dominate conversations at events like this is how to open up the political space for citizens' participation.
Almost 3 decades ago,
Ekiti State Governor Dr. Kayode Fayemi joins the conversation virtually. He and a former Minister of Information, Mr. Frank Wike Jr., urged citizens to hold elected political leaders accountable for their actions.
Our pursuit of a more result-driven democracy that translates to meaningful developmental outcomes cannot be achieved without robust citizens' engagement and effective participation in public affairs. It is therefore time that we, the people, assume our authority and wield the inherent power to place a demand on good governance and institutional accountability.
in the transition to an open, transparent, and more accountable state, efforts have been made at all levels to reduce corruption by reforming erstwhile opaque and largely secretive financial management systems. The added value in a civil society monitoring initiative such as this is the degree to which it empowers the broader citizenry to demand change from the elected authority by monitoring performance in an independently verifiable manner.
The open governance system is a structure that encourages transparency in government, with citizens having access to government data and holding leaders accountable. The Minister of Budget and National Planning emphasizes the need for civil society groups to collaborate with the government.
I think you need to work with us more as a partnership rather than being seen as an attack dog, because that doesn't help. Because if I see you as an enemy, then I'm not going to open my books to you no matter what you say.
The Nigeria civic space has opened up gradually in recent years, but the consensus at this meeting is that more young people need to participate and ask the right questions on the stewardship of political leaders.
Well, I'll be asking my guests to react to that in a moment, but I hear that Kayode has a question. Kayode.
Well, thanks, Mark. But I think I'll just merge it together because it's quite important to keep that flow from that particular event. And let me take this to Dr. Hussaini now. And pardon me, I'll keep going back like everyone to Mark West's definition, or at least the general definition of democracy, which she started off with. And I think it makes a big assumption, and I probably would just like you to clear that once and for all. It makes an assumption that, yes, democracy is government of the people, by the people, for the people. And you see people being repeated in that definition, essentially saying that people naturally want to be involved in government, as in actively involved, not just some section of people, right? Not just the political elites, party members, but everyone, the people, essentially, 200 million Nigerians. Do you think that is true for Nigeria from what you have seen? Do you think the average Nigerian, I mean, for the lack of a better term, every Nigerian really wants to be involved in government and by extension, this democracy?
Thanks, Kayode. Interesting question, and actually somewhat theoretical question. I guess I would respond to that in two ways. One is to say that, of course, there are people who are not necessarily political or politicized. There are people who have other interests that, take up their time, and there should be space for that. Not everybody wants to engage in these sorts of conversations. Some people want to get about their day. But I think on a more fundamental level, there is something, there is an aspect maybe of who we are as human beings, and this is true of Nigerians, this is true of people in other countries and across the world. There is something, I think, about us that prompts us to desire some level of autonomy. So people, to put it plainly, are involved in self-government on a daily basis. People are making decisions that, or want to make decisions that make their lives better. So I think that's the foundation of the idea of democracy, is that why don't we give people at the macro scale the decision-making capacities that they desire at the micro scale, right? People want to be able to make basic decisions that order their private lives. The idea of democracy is to extend that into the public sphere. And by and large, in the context of Nigeria, we've seen that people want to exercise that right. Sure, there's questions of voter apathy. Sure that people are often disillusioned or cynical about one election after the other producing quite similar developmental results. But at the same time, we've not seen really substantial demands for any alternative form of government. And in fact, whenever people are polled about alternatives, for instance, autocracy or military rule, overwhelmingly Nigerians say that they don't want that alternative, right? That they prefer at least, the basic allowances of being able to cast your vote. So, on the one hand, I hear you. Not everybody is politicized or political, but on the other hand, I think fundamentally we can all agree that we want to make decisions about our private lives. So why shouldn't we, given that capacity, also have the space to make decisions about how we order society more generally?
But by extension, then, you're saying that we'll never have that kind of democracy that we want to get until we decentralize, as it were. And I know this conversation is not about the whole restructuring debate and, give more powers to the federative units kind of talk. But from what you're saying, you say that everyone essentially is interested in some sort of self-governance. And I imagine that it will mean having to decentralize such that people at the local government levels can come together and say, well, this is what we want, and have some sort of power to back that up. So if we're going to move from the hybrid kind of democracy which Nigeria has been said to be practicing to proper democracy, are you essentially saying that we cannot get there until we restructure?
Well, I think leaving aside the kind of quagmire of restructuring, it's certainly true that we need much more accountable government, at the very local level. And as my fellow panelists have said, the local government has been eroded of its capacity to provide services and to actually be a tier of government that reflects the aspirations of local people. So local governments are frequently dissolved and replaced with caretaker governments, and of course that removes democracy at the level where it, in theory, should matter most. So we certainly need much more robust, much more independent, much more empowered and accountable local governments. There's no debating that. And I think you will find very few Nigerians who would oppose that. So in a way, I think that's already, that debate, so to speak, is already resolved in our context. So why don't we have, if there's by and large quite a large amount of support, almost ubiquitous support for increased self-government at the local level, then why don't we have that? And I think those are the sorts of questions that require answering urgently if we are to make substantial progress as a democracy. So just to affirm that again, certainly there's widespread outcries for much more autonomy at the local government level. And in fact, you will hear political office holders constantly affirm it rhetorically. But how can we get from that rhetorical affirmation to the actual implementation and institutionalization of accountable and open and independent local governments? And I think that will be a critical marker of progress for us as a country that we are frankly, again, to echo the other panelists, we are frankly yet to accomplish.
In your research, I'd like to know, what was the fundamental difference in terms of, looking at it across Africa in comparison to Nigeria, particularly when it has to do with political participation on the part of the people? Where does that change need to happen more? Is it at the elite level or at the grassroots level, in order for us to have a more semblance of democracy?
Thanks, Chamberlain. I would say that there needs to be more civic participation across the board. And there we're talking about kind of ordinary people, the voters, right? We're talking about citizens, not necessarily political office holders, because of course they are engaged in politics nonstop. I mean, they do more politics than governance, right? So they are very politically active. What we're talking about is people who are outside of power. And the sorts of political participation that I think would substantially transform the country have to occur, again, across the board. It has to be at the very local level, at the state level, at the national level. It has to be within political parties. It also, believe it or not, has to even be at the workplace, right? We need to have, for democracy to substantially progress, we have to practice it, right? We have to actually get the opportunity or increase the available opportunities to practice it, to practice the capacity to make decisions, in a way that favors, agreed upon rules and that favors people's rights or power to choose for themselves. So I think, once again, within political parties, at the very local levels, at the state levels, at the national levels, it's those countries where you see a very robust civic engagement, where you see citizens challenging decisions that they don't like, affirming decisions that actually move their interests forward. It's in those contexts that you see economic progress and that you see increased social cohesion. Whereas in contexts such as ours, where people are increasingly alienated from the political process because the cost of participation is so high, where there's violence, or where effectively people are doubtful about whether or not their votes count, then people are forced to take other forms of political engagement in order to express their views. And sometimes those forms are
if I could
less
just
than
jump
desirable, you know? So we've seen
So-
people embrace violent means of expressing
In
themselves as citizens in the absence
in
of
different
having
parts of Africa, still on the same democratic dispensation, but you know, we have tried the parliamentary system, then you've got this system. In other parts as well, you have those who have the parliamentary system of governance, and then systems such as ours, which we presently are practicing at the moment. Was there any fundamental difference in terms of, you know, that governance getting to the people or enhancing their participation as a result of those two systems of governance, from what your research?
Yeah, so, I mean, my work is not primarily focused on comparing parliament to the presidential system, but I think, you know, even Nigeria's own history is interesting, teaches us interesting lessons about the benefits, say, of parliamentary system versus the presidential one. Because, you know, say, prior to the 70s, when we abandoned the parliamentary system and embraced the presidential one, you still had a plurality of parties within parliament, right? Say, you had parties that represented sort of progressive or social democratic traditions. You had parties that claimed to be conservative. You know, you had parties that articulated competing economic visions. You know, you had what is popularly called ideology, right?
Okay.
In how parties competed. That remained true, you know, in the Second Republic, which was the first democratic republic we had in Nigeria.
All right.
Where we had a
Dr.
presidential
Hussaini,
system of government.
pardon me to jump in here. Let me bring in
this.
Pardon my apologies. Let me bring Dr. Ikechukwu on this. You know, how easy or difficult is it to measure these things, especially perhaps if people talk about their lives, their livelihood, what has changed ever since they had the previous system of government, and then you have a democracy. Is it that straightforward to measure those indices, especially when it has to do with social issues, Dr. Ikechukwu?
No, it's usually not that straightforward. The quality of human capital and the political economy of the environment is usually an overriding consideration. You set up a parliamentary system, and my behavior and your behavior doesn't change. Our priorities do not change. Our attitude to public resources do not change. You will get the same result. So that's about that, whether there are several or all kinds of systems. Then there's the question of the level of political maturity, both of the people and of the system. And finally, on the matter of measuring performance in terms of impact on the citizens, there are things to consider. At the level of the economy, it's not just about budgeting. Ease of doing business, has it improved? Environment of doing business, is it any better? Return on investment, how is it looking? Amount of money coming in from outside the country. So that in looking at democracy today as Democracy Day, the issues to consider are not just whether we are practicing democracy, but to isolate the pillars of democracy, note how well we're doing on some of those pillars, identify lapses that need to be remedied, identify the successes that need to be strengthened, and then for the parties to progressively involve the people. The question was asked earlier whether it will depend on the elite or the people to get involved. At the moment, it's the elite that holds the reins, that determines everything. And so you find that a change of operating rules, or if you like, rules of engagement, will naturally cascade down. If, for instance, the parties now begin to adopt slightly new methods, part of it will include political education of the people. It will impact how they affect whatever goes on around them. The concept of responsibility, for instance, needs to be understood across party lines, and the drill down has to occur. But to sit down and expect that the people, if I'm a member of a political party, we're all members of political parties, will all jump up in excitement and change the rules of engagement. As things are structured now, that cannot happen. very easily, but it can happen if the party leadership, progressive party leadership, begins to design and implement reforms. And the thing to note about that is that a good deal of the time, those who criticize parties for their performance do not take the further step of seeing the challenges in the operating environment that are even constraining both the party leadership and the, if you like, party elders. So my summary take on that is that measurement could be done with the right or the wrong paradigms. If you measure democracy anywhere in the world by the existence of physical infrastructure based on expenditures, you could say that democracy has brought a lot of development, and you're talking about infrastructure. But you find that you can find exactly the same or even better quality of infrastructure in a dictatorship, so that's not the primary criterion. The primary criterion for measuring a democracy is the degree of liberty in the living space. The fact that you can disagree with me, and that even though I disagree with you, if it turns out that there are more people who are on your side, I will let what you want happen and not protest, because I've been given a chance to express myself. Now, if there's a lot more of that going on, then you're talking about a democracy. If you're asking whether our democracy has reached the ideal, it has not. If you're then asking, should we then abandon it because it hasn't reached the ideal, I'll ask you, when a child is born and is learning to walk, do you kill the child because he didn't walk in 1 month? No. It's a developmental process. There are lapses, like I said, even retrogressions, but we cannot, on account of that, determine that this journey can be terminated. It can't, it shouldn't. If we also look at the spaces that have been less than democratic in more recent times, you see that they've jumped into a ditch, like where the parties have occurred. Yes, people are talking about Arab Spring, and I ask myself, in the places it occurred, how is Libya today? Those countries are gone for good. So while it's possible to sit in your house and shout with excitement about many things, you've not considered that there will be no space to live in if those things come. But that also presents a warning to all of us who hold public responsibility to conduct state affairs in such a way that the desire to complain will reduce, the need to want change will reduce, and the sense of belonging and genuine citizenship and possibly patriotism will become part of public. That should be the focus. Those should be the reminders. That should be plaguing, in public consciousness on a day like this.
I think that, we can safely leave it there, but I'll quickly ask you for your closing comments. What would you like citizens to, and leaders perhaps, to take away on a day like this?
There have been a lot of positive steps made. There's been some progress in certain areas of our institutional and social life, but there's a long road ahead of us. And I think fundamentally it's important to emphasize that what is required here is more democracy, more spaces for us to exercise our right to self-government, and not less.
I think it's a fine place to leave it. We have to thank you gentlemen for coming on Sunrise Early this morning. Dr. Oke Ikechukwu is the Executive Director of Development Specs Academy. Thank you for coming. And Dr. Saeed Hussaini is the Director of Research at the Center for Democracy and Development. We'll take a break now. When we come back, we'll be switching gears to the economy. Just stay with us.